This is Kent Mulgat with KelownaNow, joined by Quinton Pullen from Grant Thornton, and we're talking about the budget. Now, you've only had an hour or so to digest all this, and it's 500 pages.
Absolutely.
But the first thing I wanted to talk to you as an accountant is this change in the tax regime for small business and passive income. This is like investment income that small business might have.
Yep.
You had
Absolutely.
some worries about this before the budget came out. How are you feeling now that you've seen what we've actually seen happen here?
I'm actually feeling a lot better than what I had initially worried. The initial proposals that came out last year were going to be quite punitive, and what they came out with today isn't nearly as bad as what we were expecting.
So how will this affect a small business with passive income?
Well, any small business that has more than $50,000 of passive income it'll reduce the amount of small business deduction that they're eligible to use for their active income.
Okay.
So the sole purpose to the small business deduction was to help businesses reinvest their money into the active operations of the business. Now, if they have more than $50,000 of passive income, it means that clearly they don't need all that money to go into passive income unless there's something else going on, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot of exceptions here, and there's going to be things that we don't like. But the theory is, or the thoughts that the Liberals have, is that this way they're going to go after people who don't necessarily need the small business deduction, and all they're doing is they're reducing their deferral.
Right. The document apparently mentions gender about 438 times. It seems that almost everything in the budget had a sort of gender consideration to it. It's going to cost a fair amount of money, but do you think there's room in the business community for efforts to sort of increase the role of women in higher positions?
I think there's always room in this area. I think everything is going to be up for debate, and I couldn't even comment on what. The one thing I noticed in the budget is it said that they were going to propose measures to decrease the pay gap between men and women. But they didn't come up with any numbers. My understanding is there's no numbers here. This is just something that they're looking at doing, and they're going to come out with more later.
And it sounds like, and it's legislation, right? Which
will be at some point. But if there's no numbers coming out, then we don't know. And I assume the legislation. I haven't seen any legislation on this yet, so we don't know what that's actually going to mean when it comes out. Which it's showing intent, but whether that intent actually follows up with action, I don't know.
You know, the first thing that I look at when I have to look at a budget, which I try to avoid doing, is the bottom line. You know, $18 billion deficit. And, you know, from what I'm hearing, aren't we having a good year financially, Canada? We've sort of exceeded expectations, leading the G7. Isn't this the kind of year when we should be socking money away, or at least balancing the budget? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, the way economic theory goes, and I'm no economist here, but is that when you have a bad year, you spend more money to help build the economy, and then when you have a good year, you take that extra money that you have and you use it to pay down debt.
Right.
Currently, that's not what's happening.
Right. So we're adding to our debt, and there's another thing that you mentioned, is that there was nothing in there in terms of tax breaks for the business community, such as they're getting in the United States, creating a bit of an imbalance that could drain away business?
Absolutely. It's all about international competitiveness. So the way things have been prior to the new tax reform down in the US was that Canada had a lower corporate tax rate than they had in the US, so that people would actually try to shift income as often as possible to Canada. And with the new US rules, that's not happening to the same extent. And the hope was that Canada was going to do something to offset this, to encourage the international community to still bring business to Canada. But that's not happening right now.
It seems that when you look at the bottom line, I mean, the States already has an astounding national debt, and there doesn't seem to be really an economic basis for these tax cuts. Like they're really doing tax cuts that they don't seem to be able to afford anyway. So it looks unsustainable. But at the same time, you feel Canada sort of needs to go in lockstep?
Well, I don't know if lockstep is the right word. What we're looking for is some way to maintain competitive, right? To maintain competitiveness with the U.S. You're absolutely right. What seems to be happening is can't be sustainable. But economic theory suggests you lower tax rate and the business will boom and it'll increase the economy, and somehow it's supposed to work itself out. So I'm not saying that we should have matched theirs. I just don't know exactly what the right thing was, but it would have been nice to address it.
But overall, what is this sort of atmosphere around Grant Thornton when they see a budget like this come out? Or, I mean, you mentioned some relief about that one
Absolutely.
item, but overall, are people sort of relieved that it's not as...
From what I've seen so far, again, I haven't had enough time to digest or even talk to my colleagues across the country yet on thoughts on all the different plans. But from a high-level perspective, it's definitely not as bad as we were expecting. So we were expecting some horrible rules, and they cut a lot of those out. So
Right.
So I'm definitely feeling relieved to that.
Yeah, there's one element in the budget where they're reaching out with a program to help journalism, the news media.
Yep, I saw that.
And $50 million, which sounds like a fair number at first, and then you find out, oh no, it's over 5 years. And then you really look at the amount of dollars and the size of our country, and in a budget in a federal budget, they can make all these things, but they're almost just like gestures, right? The dollar figures don't really compute much when you spread it across the country.
Absolutely, it's all in how you put it, right?
Yeah.
You put something out and say this is what I'm promoting, and then actually you dig into the details, and that's not always the case, and that ends up being the case in a lot of different plans, right? Everything sounds good when you read it up first, and then you start digging into the details, and often it's not quite as great as you're hoping.
Not a whole lot can really change in one budget, right?
I haven't seen it.
Yeah. Anyway, I appreciate you coming in and trying to help us make some sense of it.
Absolutely.
As Quinton Pullen from Grant Thornton, you're watching Kelowna Now.